The year was 1942. The world was on fire, and Asia was the center of it all. In just a few months, Japan's armies had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Singapore, once called the Gibraltar of the East, had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were under siege, and the skies above Australia burned red as bombs rained down on the city of Darwin. For millions, it felt as though the world was spinning out of control. The speed, precision, and ferocity of Japan's campaign left Allied forces reeling. Their defenses shattered before they even knew where the next strike would come from. In less than 3 months, the myth of Western invincibility in Asia had collapsed. Soldiers who once believed they were defending an unshakable empire suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and utterly unprepared for the storm that had arrived. This was not just another chapter of World War I, it was the moment when power in the Pacific shifted forever. The Allies, desperate and divided, scrambled to hold the line. Commanders from 4 nations, the Americans, the British, the Dutch, and the Australians, came together under one fragile alliance known as ABDA Command. Their mission was clear: stop Japan before it reached the vital island of Java. But what awaited them was a catastrophe that would echo through naval history, a battle that would prove skill, discipline, and technology could outweigh even courage and numbers. As we look back on these events, we will explore not only the strategy and chaos of the Battle of the Java Sea, but also the human cost, the courage of sailors who fought against impossible odds, the political struggles behind the front lines, and the lessons that still resonate today. If you are fascinated by stories of strategy, resilience, and the men and women who stood against overwhelming power, you are in the right place. Here, we bring history to life not as a list of dates and names, but as the heartbeat of real people caught in extraordinary times. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. It helps us keep creating powerful stories like this one. Every click supports our mission to uncover the hidden battles, the forgotten voices, and the defining moments that shaped our world. Now, let us travel back to the early months of 1942, to the stormy waters of the South Pacific, where courage met catastrophe, and the fate of nations hung in the balance. This is the story of how Japan destroyed the Allied Armada in the biggest naval battle in decades, and how the echoes of that defeat would change the course of the war. As Japan's victories spread like wildfire across Southeast Asia, the Allied world turned its eyes to one man, General Douglas MacArthur. In the Philippines, MacArthur had become the symbol of defiance, a man standing firm against the unstoppable tide of Japanese power. For months, he and his exhausted troops had clung to the battered defenses of Bataan and Corregidor, refusing to yield even as supplies dwindled and hope faded. He was not just a commander. He was a beacon for those who still believed that the Allies could turn the tide. Yet, behind the heroism, there was a grim reality, one that would soon force MacArthur to make a decision that tore at his very soul. By February 1942, the Philippines had become a trap. Japanese forces had surrounded the islands, cutting off reinforcement and resupply. The skies were ruled by Japanese bombers, and the seas swarmed with their warships. Every message reaching MacArthur from Washington carried the same undertone. The situation was untenable. He had promised to hold his ground, to share the fate of his soldiers no matter what. To him, abandoning the Philippines was unthinkable, a betrayal of the men who trusted him, of the ideals he had sworn to defend. But the call from President Franklin D. Roosevelt changed everything. The order was not a request. It was an imperative. Roosevelt and his advisors understood the symbolic weight of MacArthur's name. He had become a legend in the American press, a man whose courage and leadership gave the public something to believe in amid the relentless march of defeat. Losing him would be a blow not just to military command but to morale across the entire Allied world. As bitter as it was, the decision was made. MacArthur was to evacuate to Australia, reorganize, and lead the counter-offensive from there. His personal feelings were irrelevant. He had to live to fight another day. Still, MacArthur resisted. He offered to resign his command and return as a volunteer, willing to fight and die alongside his men. Those who served close to him recalled the heavy silence in the tunnels of Corregidor as the order was read aloud, a silence broken only by the distant thunder of enemy artillery. To leave meant survival, but it also meant guilt. For a man whose life had been defined by honor and service, retreat felt like surrender. In early March, under the cover of darkness, MacArthur, his family, and a small party of aides boarded a patrol boat that would take them across the perilous waters of Mindanao. The journey was fraught with danger. Japanese patrols scoured the seas, and storms battered their small convoy. Every hour could have been their last. When they finally reached Australia, MacArthur's first words to the press were resolute, echoing with a promise that would soon become immortal. "I came through, and I shall return." Those 5 words were not just a declaration of intent. They became a rallying cry for the Allied forces reeling from loss after loss. MacArthur's escape symbolized something larger than one man's survival. It represented endurance, the idea that even in retreat, the fight was not over. Australia became the new bastion of hope, a staging ground from which the Pacific War would eventually be turned around. But at that moment, hope was all they had. The Allies were on the defensive everywhere. Singapore had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were collapsing. Burma was in chaos. And soon, in the waters north of Australia, another disaster was about to unfold, one that would shatter the last remnants of Allied naval strength in the region. From his new headquarters in Melbourne, MacArthur began to rebuild what was left of the Allied command. Communication lines were weak, supply chains fragile, and coordination between the different nations strained by distrust and desperation. Yet even as the situation seemed hopeless, there was a growing sense of purpose. America's industrial power was awakening. Troop convoys were forming. Plans were being drawn. The retreat from the Philippines had not been the end, it was the beginning of a long, painful journey toward redemption. While MacArthur planned his next move, thousands of his men were still trapped in the Philippines, cut off from reinforcements, starving, and outnumbered. They continued to fight with a grim determination that defied logic. Their bravery stood as a silent rebuke to the tide of defeat. In their suffering, the world saw the cost of war not measured in battles won or lost, but in the endurance of those who refused to yield. MacArthur carried that burden with him every day. His retreat might have been strategic, but in his heart, it was personal. The story of MacArthur's evacuation is often told as a tale of heroism and destiny, but it is also one of impossible choices. It was about the fine line between duty and survival, pride and pragmatism. His departure marked the end of one chapter of the Pacific War, and the beginning of another, a war that would test the limits of human will, strategy, and sacrifice. By the time MacArthur's boots touched the soil of Australia, the map of the Pacific had already been redrawn. Japan's empire stretched from the jungles of Burma to the coral reefs of the Solomon Islands. The Allies' once formidable presence in Asia was now a shadow of its former self. But within that shadow flickered a new light, the belief that they could, and would, fight back. As MacArthur looked north toward the waters he had crossed, he knew the road ahead would be long and merciless. Yet he also understood something that the chaos of defeat could not erase, that sometimes retreat is not failure, but the gathering of strength for a greater return. And though the guns had fallen silent in the Philippines for now, the promise of those words, "I shall return," would carry across the Pacific, echoing through every battle yet to come. The British Indian 17th Division had been holding the line in Burma, fighting desperately to slow the advancing Japanese forces sweeping up from Thailand. These men, drawn from both the British Army and the Indian subcontinent, had already endured weeks of fighting in mud, rain, and exhaustion. Supplies were scarce, the terrain unforgiving, and communication with headquarters was often lost in the chaos of retreat. Yet, despite it all, they clung to their orders: hold as long as possible and deny the enemy a direct route toward Rangoon, the vital port that stood as Britain's last major stronghold in Burma. The Sitting River, wide and treacherous, marked the final natural barrier between the 17th Division and safety. On the western bank lay the promise of regrouping and survival. On the eastern side, the Japanese forces were closing in fast. The division's commander, Major General Jack Smith, faced an impossible decision, one that would go down in history as one of the most tragic moments in the Burma campaign. As dawn broke on February 22, 1942, the skies over the Sitting Bridge filled with the sound of distant explosions. Columns of smoke rose from the jungle as Japanese aircraft strafed retreating Allied convoys. Soldiers stumbled across the muddy roads, leading mules and carrying wounded comrades. Vehicles jammed the narrow approaches to the bridge, and officers shouted themselves hoarse trying to maintain order. The men knew that once they crossed the bridge, they might live to fight another day. But if they were caught east of it, they faced certain doom. General Smythe's orders were clear: the bridge was to be held at all costs until every unit had crossed. Yet, the situation deteriorated faster than anyone could have imagined. Japanese patrols were reported only miles away, threatening to flank the crossing and seize it from the east. Communications broke down completely, and panic began to spread among the rear units. The engineers had wired the bridge for demolition, ready to blow it up if the enemy reached its edge. But as confusion deepened, the signal for detonation came too soon. At around 5:30 on February 23, a thunderous explosion shattered the morning air. The bridge, the lifeline of the 17th Division, was blown apart in a roar of fire and splintered steel. The men on the western side could only watch in stunned silence as the structure collapsed into the swirling waters below. Thousands of their comrades were still stranded on the far bank, cut off from any route of escape. What followed was a scene of utter despair. On the eastern side, chaos reigned. Soldiers waded into the river, clutching their rifles and equipment, trying desperately to swim across under fire. Many were swept away by the current. Others were shot down by Japanese snipers who had already reached the banks. Small groups attempted to build makeshift rafts from debris and driftwood, but few survived the crossing. The cries of men calling for help held through the jungle, a haunting reminder of how quickly fortune could turn in war. General Smith later defended his decision, arguing that leaving the bridge intact would have handed the Japanese a direct route into central Burma. He claimed it was better to sacrifice part of the division than to lose the entire theater. Yet, to those who were left behind, the logic offered little comfort. They had fought bravely, believing rescue was near, only to find themselves abandoned in one of the most brutal episodes of the campaign. Survivors who managed to swim across often arrived without weapons, uniforms, or strength. Many collapsed upon reaching the western bank, their faces hollow with shock. The destruction of the Sitting Bridge became a turning point. It symbolized not only a tactical blunder, but also the crumbling coordination of the Allied forces in Southeast Asia. The British command, already strained by the loss of Singapore and the fall of Malaya, now faced the grim reality that Burma, too, might be lost. The 17th Division, reduced to fragments, could no longer hold the line. Japanese troops soon crossed the river elsewhere, advancing toward Rangoon with unstoppable momentum. For the men of the division, the ordeal left scars that lasted long after the guns fell silent. Some were captured and forced into harrowing marches through the jungle. Others joined local resistance groups, continuing the fight from the shadows. Letters written by survivors described the haunting guilt of those who escaped, while their comrades drowned or disappeared. They spoke of nightmares filled with the sound of collapsing steel and the sight of hands reaching out from the water, moments that would never fade. In the broader scope of the war, the loss at the Sitting River underscored the vulnerability of the Allied position in Asia. It revealed how communication breakdowns, hasty decisions, and underestimation of the Japanese advance could turn a strategic withdrawal into a disaster. The bridge's destruction delayed the Japanese only briefly, but the morale blow it dealt to Allied forces was far deeper. It also reinforced a crucial lesson that coordination and clarity in the midst of chaos could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. In the months that followed, the British Empire would lose Rangoon, retreat into India, and face a long, grueling struggle to reclaim what had been lost. Yet, out of the ashes of the Sitting tragedy emerged a new determination. The soldiers who survived became symbols of endurance, men who had faced the worst and lived to rebuild. Their suffering was not in vain, for it forged the resolve that would one day lead the Allies back across Burma's rivers, through its jungles, and into victory. As the tide of war surged across the Pacific in early 1942, the collapse of Allied defenses in Asia sent shockwaves through every capital of the British Empire. Singapore had fallen in February, its surrender marking one of the darkest moments in British military history. In Burma, the destruction of the Sitting Bridge left thousands of men stranded east of the river, signaling the beginning of a desperate retreat. And now, Australia, long considered a distant outpost of the Empire, found itself facing the terrifying possibility of invasion. Japanese aircraft had bombed Darwin, reducing the northern port to ruins and proving that the Pacific was no longer a distant battlefield. The war had arrived on Australia's doorstep, and fear spread across the continent like wildfire. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was juggling crises on multiple fronts. The Blitz had ravaged Britain, North Africa was still contested, and the Atlantic was crawling with U-boats. To him, the defense of the empire was a global matter. He viewed every colony and dominion as a part of a single, interconnected war effort that needed to follow one central strategy, his own. But in Canberra, Prime Minister John Curtin saw things differently. Australia had relied for generations on Britain's promise of protection. Yet as Japanese warships prowled the Pacific and Allied bases fell one after another, that promise now seemed dangerously fragile. Curtin, a man of quiet determination and unshakable resolve, had risen to power only months earlier. When he looked at the map, he saw the stark reality. British forces were stretched thin, their fleets scattered, and their armies retreating. The fall of Singapore meant that the shield protecting Australia from the north was gone. Burma was collapsing, and American forces in the Philippines were under siege. To Curtin, continuing to place Australia's fate entirely in British hands was no longer acceptable. He believed that Australia must take control of its own destiny, even if it meant breaking with imperial tradition. The tension between London and Canberra soon turned into open disagreement. Churchill, ever confident in his own judgment, urged that Australian troops fighting in the Middle East remain where they were, arguing that defeating the Axis in Europe and North Africa would ultimately secure the Pacific. Curtin, however, demanded that those same divisions be brought home immediately. With Japanese aircraft bombing northern cities and submarines sighted off the coast, he saw no sense in leaving Australia exposed. To him, defending Cairo or Tobruk meant little if Sydney or Melbourne were next in line for attack. Their correspondence grew increasingly heated. Churchill tried to persuade Curtin that the Royal Navy would guarantee Australia's safety, even as British ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Curtin, unimpressed by distant assurances, issued a statement that would redefine Australia's foreign policy forever. On December 27, 1941, he declared that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. It was a bold announcement, one that shocked London and electrified Washington. For the first time, Australia publicly acknowledged that its security depended not on Britain, but on the emerging power of the United States. The decision infuriated Churchill, who saw it as a personal affront and a dangerous sign of fragmentation within the Commonwealth. He worried that if each dominion acted independently, the entire imperial system would unravel. But Curtin was unmoved. He had seen the Japanese advance firsthand, and he understood that Australia could not afford to wait for reinforcements that might never come. His priority was clear: protect Australian soil, safeguard Australian lives, and ensure that his nation would not fall victim to the same complacency that had doomed Singapore. Behind the political arguments lay a deeper emotional divide. Churchill, steeped in the traditions of empire, viewed Britain as the heart of a global family, one where loyalty flowed naturally from colony to crown. Curtin, however, represented a new kind of leader: pragmatic, nationalist, and willing to challenge old hierarchies in the name of survival. He did not despise Britain, but he no longer saw it as infallible. In his Australia's loyalty could no longer be blind. It had to be earned through action, not sentiment. The turning point came with the arrival of General Douglas MacArthur in March 1942. Having escaped the fall of the Philippines, MacArthur landed in Australia to take command of Allied operations in the Southwest Pacific. His presence confirmed that the United States was now the dominant power in the region. Under his leadership, Australian and American forces would fight side by side in campaigns that stretched from New Guinea to the Solomon Islands. For Curtin, it was vindication of his decision to look to America. For Churchill, it was a bitter reminder that Britain's influence in the Pacific was fading. Yet, despite their clashes, both men shared a fundamental goal: the defeat of Japan. While their strategies differed, their resolve was unwavering. Over time, the strain between them softened, replaced by mutual respect born from necessity. Curtin's insistence on defending Australia did not fracture the Allied cause, it strengthened it. His actions ensured that Australia became a crucial base for the counteroffensive that would eventually push Japan back across the Pacific. The disagreements between Churchill and Curtin were more than political. They marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain and its former colonies. For centuries, Australia had been a loyal outpost of the Empire, its soldiers fighting under the Union Jack in faraway wars. But in 1942, under the shadow of invasion, that identity began to change. Australia no longer saw itself merely as Britain's child. It was an independent nation fighting for its own survival on its own soil. In hindsight, the rift between the two leaders was inevitable. The old world of empire was giving way to a new order shaped by alliances based on geography and shared security rather than blood or tradition. Curtin's defiance laid the foundation for Australia's modern identity, one that stood proudly alongside its allies, but never again beneath them. And in that moment of crisis, when the Japanese threat loomed largest, Australia's determination to stand on its own feet became a symbol of hope, not just for the Pacific, but for every nation fighting to define its future in a world engulfed by war. By late February 1942, the Allies were standing on the edge of disaster in the Pacific. One territory after another had fallen to Japan's relentless advance, and the enemy's forces now loomed over the Dutch East Indies, a region rich in oil, rubber, and other resources vital to Japan's war machine. For the Allies, this archipelago represented the last fragile line of defense between Japan and the vast southern reaches of the Pacific, including Australia itself. Out of desperation and duty, ships from four nations, the United States, Britain, the Netherlands, and Australia, were assembled into a single fleet under the command of Dutch Admiral Karel Doorman. It was a bold, almost reckless attempt to stop the Japanese juggernaut before it swallowed the entire region. The Allied fleet, known as the ABDA Strike Force, American, British, Dutch, and Australian, was a makeshift coalition of ships hastily brought together from distant commands. Its vessels varied widely in age, firepower, and technology. The American cruisers Houston and Marblehead, both veterans of older wars, fought alongside the British Exeter, the Dutch cruisers De Ruyter and Java, and the Australian destroyer Perth. Their crews spoke different languages, followed different procedures, and relied on different communication codes, yet they shared a single mission: confront Japan's fleet and buy precious time for the collapsing Allied positions in Southeast Asia. The men who sailed out from Surabaya on February 26 knew they were outmatched. Japanese naval power in the region was immense, led by experienced commanders and supported by carrier-based aircraft that could strike far beyond the range of Allied guns. But courage, not numbers, drove Doorman's fleet forward. His orders were simple: seek out and destroy the Japanese invasion convoy threatening Java. If they failed, the last major Allied base in the Dutch East Indies would fall within days. The next afternoon, February 27, 1942, the Allied fleet sighted the enemy in the Java Sea. The Japanese task force, commanded by Rear Admiral Takeo Kaji, sailed with superior coordination and discipline. Their ships carried powerful long lance torpedoes, deadly weapons capable of traveling farther and hitting harder than anything the Allies possessed. When the first salvos echoed across the sea, it became immediately clear who held the advantage. From the bridge of the De Ruyter, Admiral Doorman signaled his fleet to engage. Shells began to fall around them, fountains of water rising as the ships maneuvered into battle formation. The Allied cruisers opened fire, their guns thundering against the horizon, but their salvos fell short or wide. Japanese gunners, trained to precision, responded with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, the British cruiser Exeter took a direct hit that crippled her engines, forcing her to withdraw under escort. The rest of the fleet pressed on, undeterred, even as the sea erupted with torpedo tracks slicing through the waves. The battle raged into the evening, a deadly game of maneuver and endurance fought under a blood-red sky. Allied destroyers darted between larger ships, laying smoke screens to shield their damaged comrades, while the cruisers continued firing in the fading light. But the Japanese maintained control, attacking in coordinated waves and cutting off every attempt by Doorman to reach the invasion fleet. When darkness fell, confusion deepened. Radio communication broke down, and the multinational crews struggled to interpret orders amid the chaos. Shortly after nightfall, tragedy struck. The Dutch cruiser Java was hit by a torpedo and exploded in a brilliant flash, sinking within minutes and taking most of her crew with her. Moments later, De Ruyter Admiral Doorman's flagship was struck as well. Flames engulfed the ship from bow to stern. The Admiral, refusing to abandon his men, went down with her, along with nearly 350 sailors. His last signal before the end was simple and haunting: "I'm attacking. Follow me." Those words would become a symbol of courage and sacrifice for generations to come. The surviving ships, scattered and damaged, attempted to flee under the cover of darkness, but the Japanese hunted them relentlessly. Over the next 2 days, one Allied vessel after another was cornered and destroyed. The American cruiser Houston and the Australian Perth, both trying to escape through Sunda Strait, encountered another Japanese force and were sunk after a furious night battle. By March 1, nearly the entire ABDA fleet had been lost. In less than 72 hours, the Allies had suffered one of the most devastating naval defeats in modern history. The Battle of the Java Sea was more than just a tactical loss, it was the end of an era. It marked the collapse of Allied sea power in the East Indies and sealed the fate of the region. Without naval protection, Java fell within a week, and the remaining Allied forces were forced to surrender or retreat to Australia. The Japanese, meanwhile, stood triumphant. their path through the Pacific wide open. For the men who fought there, the battle was remembered not for its success but for its spirit. The sailors of 4 nations, fighting side by side for the first time, demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Many of them went into combat knowing they might not return, yet they fought on to the last shell, the last torp, the last breath. Survivors who were later rescued or captured spoke of the eerie calm before the final attacks. The quiet moments when they looked across the decks and saw men from different countries working together as one. In that shared struggle, they found a unity stronger than fear. The aftermath of the battle was grim. Families across the Netherlands, Britain, America, and Australia received word that their loved ones were missing or presumed lost. The sea had claimed hundreds of lives, and for many, no graves would ever be found. But even at the defeat, there was a growing recognition that this sacrifice had not been in vain. The stand in the Java Sea delayed the Japanese advance just long enough for Allied forces to regroup further south. It gave Australia time to strengthen its defenses and allowed the United States to consolidate its growing power in the Pacific. The defeat also served as a brutal lesson. The Allies realized that outdated tactics and disjointed command structures could no longer stand against Japan's modernized navy. It forced a complete reevaluation of how the war would be fought. From the ashes of the Java Sea, a new Allied strategy began to take shape, one that would later turn the tide at battles like Coral Sea and Midway. Though Admiral Doorman and his fleet perished, their valor endured. They fought not for victory alone, but for the belief that freedom was worth defending even when hope seemed lost. In the end, their courage became the spark that would reignite Allied resistance across the Pacific, proving that even in defeat, honor and determination could outlast the darkest storm. The Battle of the Java Sea marked more than just the destruction of ships, it marked the collapse of a dream. The dream that the combined strength of the Allies could hold back the tide of Japan's expansion. When the last of Admiral Doorman's fleet slipped beneath the waves, the Allied command known as ABDA effectively ceased to exist. Its scattered survivors were left with little more than courage and a few words of defiance echoing through the radio silence. "I'm attacking. Follow me." The loss reverberated far beyond the Java Sea, shaking the confidence of Allied leaders and leaving the Pacific's southern waters in Japanese hands. With the ABDA fleet gone, Japan reigned supreme across the South Seas. One after another, islands and territories that had once flown Allied flags now bore the rising sun. The Dutch East Indies were swiftly overrun, their rich oil fields falling under Japanese control. British and American outposts were isolated, cut off from reinforcements. And for Australia, already reeling from the bombing of Darwin, the situation had never seemed more dire. The nation stood exposed, its northern coast vulnerable to invasion, its people fearful that the next Japanese offensive might strike their very homeland. In London, Prime Minister Churchill could only watch as the map of Asia turned crimson with the advance of Japan. The proud empire that had once spanned the globe now found its farthest dominions under siege. In Canberra, Prime Minister Curtin's warnings had proven painfully accurate. His insistence on prioritizing Australia's defense was no longer seen as defiance, it was survival. With British aid stretched to the limit and the ABDA command shattered, Australia's hopes turned fully toward the United States. Across the Pacific, American military planners recognized that the fall of the Java Sea had created a dangerous vacuum. If Japan's momentum was not stopped, the empire could threaten not only Australia but also vital American supply lines stretching from Hawaii to India. Thus began a new phase of the war, one that would transform the Pacific into a vast, burning battlefield. Within months, the Allied strategy shifted from desperate defense to cautious counterattack. Bases were built in northern Australia. Troops arrived from America, and the once isolated continent became the cornerstone of a new Allied resurgence. Yet, even as the war machine stirred to life, the human cost of the Java Sea disaster lingered. Thousands of sailors from 4 nations had vanished into the deep. Families waited months, sometimes years, for news that never came. For the Dutch, the loss carried particular weight. Admiral Karel Doorman, the man who had led his fleet into battle knowing full well the odds, became a national hero, a symbol of courage in the face of impossible circumstances. His name would be remembered in memorials and naval traditions for decades to come, a reminder that bravery sometimes means standing your ground even when victory is out of reach. In hindsight, the dissolution of the ABDA command was inevitable. The coalition had been created in haste, born out of crisis, and burdened by differences in language, tactics, and command philosophy. But for all its flaws, ABDA represented the first attempt by the Allies to unite across continents and confront a common enemy. Though it failed in its immediate mission, it paved the way for the stronger, more coordinated alliances that would follow. The cooperation between Australia and the United States, forged in the ashes of the Java Sea, would later become one of the pillars of the Pacific victory. For the sailors who perished in those waters, their sacrifice was not in vain. The delay they inflicted on Japan's timetable bought the Allies precious weeks, time enough for Australia to fortify, for the Americans to reposition their fleets, and for the tide of war to slowly begin turning. From that point onward, every Allied victory in the Pacific carried with it the unspoken memory of those men who had fought against impossible odds and never returned. The story of the Java Sea is, at its heart, a story of courage and consequence. It is about what happens when human determination meets overwhelming force, and how even in defeat, the will to fight can endure. The wrecks that now lie silent on the seabed are not just relics of war. They are monuments to unity, sacrifice, and the belief that freedom is worth defending, no matter the cost. Divers who visit them today find not just rusted steel, but the echoes of 4 nations bound together by a single cause. And so, as the Pacific War evolved through the trials of Coral Sea, the triumph at Midway, and the long, brutal push toward Japan, the memory of those who fell in the Java Sea continued to inspire. Their loss was the fire that tempered Allied resolve, proving that strength was not just in weapons or numbers, but in the courage to stand when all seems lost. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of World War I's most dramatic and tragic moments. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep history alive so we can continue to honor the bravery, the lessons, and the humanity behind the battles that shaped our world.